Okay, so thank you everyone for joining today. Today we have the honor of having Doug Silver being our presenter. Doug has a very diverse background, from an exploration geologist, a zoologist, and the founder and CEO and chairman of one of the largest royalty companies, International Royalty Corporation. Doug's been in Denver. He's a premier gold investor forum. He just has a wonderful breadth of knowledge and background. He's a wonderful person, and we're very honored to have him speak to us today. When I recruited Doug to have him talk to us, I asked him to make us think outside the box, Doug. I want you to come up with something that inspires some kind of communication and thought process among the students and among the participants. So today is going to be kind of a different presentation. And with that, I'll give it over to Doug. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be speaking to School of Mines again, and anybody who else is listening in. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to do exactly what Sarah challenged me, which was to go out of the box. And before I start on the talk, I want to just clarify something. You know, I've spent 40 odd years in the mining business, but my first degree was in zoology, and biology and biological ecosystems are my true love. And if you listen to my speech last year, you know how I integrate the two. I'm going to do the same thing again today, but for those of you who have a mining background or trying to get educated in mining, I think you're going to find it quite interesting how hopefully you'll find it interesting how they tie these two things together. So the outline today is pretty simple. I'm going to talk about this concept called carrying capacity. I'm going to talk about the implications of it. And then I'm going to lead you with some really big questions to think about. And these are questions to think about with respect to your careers and your personal life and all other good things. So let's get started. You know, I have raised a lot of money in my life, and I've run very large companies and private equity firms and everything else. And whenever you start a presentation, you always have a legal disclaimer, which basically gets you off the hook if you've said anything wrong, affectionately known as weasel words. So in this talk, this slide is my weasel word slide. And basically the point here is that the Earth is an extremely complex system. And if you think about it, when scientists go to a laboratory, they're usually in there trying to test for one variable. And the beauty of a lab is you can control the other variables. When they get their conclusions, it gives them insights into the variable they were testing, but it doesn't necessarily solve the whole answer of whatever the big issue is. And this is because there's simply, especially in ecosystems, there's too many variables, and some of them have embedded compounding risks and effects. And the real answer is so complicated that neither the human brain nor computers can solve it. And this is why predicting the future is almost always wrong. In addition to that, our media, in their infinite wisdom that everything is linear and it's either cause or effect, they've completely reduced our abilities to think in multiple dimensions. Yet we live on a planet that has multiple dimensions. So bottom line is humans can't predict the future. Today's a wonderful day for bringing this up. Let's see how the weather people do with yesterday's forecast, or if you talk to your local bookie, you know, you'll find out whether you won or lost. The reason I bring up this complex system is that the rest of the speech is going to talk about linear systems, cause and effect. So I'm off the hook. I told you I don't know what I'm talking about, but here we go anyway. So let's start with a simple experiment. There's a thing called a Petri dish, which is in the picture here. It's just a glass dish, and they will add nutrient to it. Typically the nutrient's called agar. And then they'll add a bacteria culture to that to test whatever they're testing. And what happens is the bacteria grow. I want to bring this up because when you start the growth process, it goes exponential, as you can see in the graph. And as the population grows, it'll begin to deplete its food supply, and also it'll increase its waste production. And eventually there won't be enough food for the population to remain healthy. And what typically happens is the old, the weak, the impaired, and the young will die off. And in the course of it, the growth rate curve will level off. And this is called the carrying capacity. In science, we use a capital letter K to stand for it. I don't know why they don't use like capital C, capital C. I wasn't around 100 years ago when they figured this out. Anyway, the carrying capacity is the sustainable population size for limited food supply and space. So in our case, it would be, you know, what's the carrying capacity of humans on planet Earth, which is a closed system. So in 1995, think about that, 1995, I mean, that was years ago, that was decades ago. A study was done where they compiled all of the studies that had been done on the carrying capacity at that point. There were 65 studies. And as you can see on the graph on the right, the most common prediction was 8 billion people. Now, if you've ever read the book, The Wisdom of Crowds, you'll understand the importance of this. The Wisdom of Crowds is a wonderful book to read, but basically, if you get a huge population and ask them a question, there will be a modal occurrence, which is usually the correct answer. So that tells me the 8 billion is probably the right answer. Anybody want to guess what today's population is? It's 8 billion. I think this is really important because granted, these are estimates and there's a degree of error and stuff. But the fact of the matter is a lot of really smart people think that we've approached the carrying capacity for the planet. And if you haven't seen this graph, this is the one that always scares the heck out of me. You know, the growth in human population really began around the time of the Industrial Revolution, roughly 1700s, the 1800s. And also in the 1800s, of course, was the explosion in science. And that's where we got all of our different disciplines in science, including medicine. And with medicine, they understood bacteria, viruses, disease, and they started preventing those things. And so the population can grow. And as you can see, it went exponential. There are predictions that the peak population will be at 10 billion, or say 2 billion more people than now. If you look at this graph, you see how the level out. And so the first graph, remember where I showed you the definition of carrying capacity, you have very steep growth and then it starts to level out. Well, the United Nations graph here is showing you that we're headed that way. And in fact, the UN had a statement that the global population growth rate peaked in the 1960s and has been slowing. That's what you'd expect as you reach the carrying capacity. In 1950, the average birth rate was 5 kids per woman. I do not know, and I'm sorry, I'm a seasoned scientist. I do not know how you create 0.05 people. I've not figured that one out. But anyway, and today the number of children per people is 2.44. Again, you have partial kids is kind of a tough one to swallow. So we are starting to see the leveling off, and this is very symptomatic of carrying capacity. And right now we're adding about 80 million people a year to the body. So what happens to achieve carrying capacity? What happens if you achieve overpopulation? Well, the first thing that happens is you have less habitat available for the organism. And this is because you have increased population density, you have insufficient food, water, and resources, and it naturally leads to starvation, malnutrition, and conflict. So let's go back through those. You know, with respect to humans, increased population density, well, centuries ago, we started to go vertical rather than horizontal to provide for our population. And so we've created these things called cities that have huge density populations, as I'm sure all and all of a sudden, many of the countries happen, starvation and malnutrition. Look at what's happened, you know, with the Ukraine war, which produces most of the world's fertilizer and a lot of the world's wheat. Can't get to Africa. What are you getting? You're getting starvation, malnutrition. Look at water. If you're not following what's going on with the Colorado River and the lack of water in it, you should, because it's symptomatic of what we're going to see around the world. You have a river that's been so overused. The water has been so overused by the 8 states that have a compact to use that water, that the giant reservoirs are at 20% of their normal carrying capacity, one of them is so low that if it gets another like 4 feet lower, it won't be able to have its electric turbines run, which means about 40 million people in Southern California and Arizona are going to be without electricity. You want to take a guess what happens when Southern Cal has no electricity? It's going to be horrible. We also see water like in the war in Yemen. The war in Yemen is very much triggered by the fact that the Yemenis used up their aquifers and now they have no water, so conflict. And conflict leads to chaos. We see these signs, all of these signs are signs of an overpopulation. I talked to you about increased waste production. Anybody following what's going on with ocean plastics? I mean, there's so much plastics that no other animal creates plastics. There's so much plastic in the ocean now, they're even detecting it in microorganisms. What about greenhouse gas emissions? Why has that become such a popular subject lately? It's because of its overpollution on the planet. And both of those are indications of increased waste production, which again, you see it starting to have an effect on the population as you approach the carrying capacity. Another thing that happens in overcrowded population is disease. It spreads very quickly. And again, all of us have just gone through it with the pandemic. And of course, the pandemic had the benefit that it also got air transportation to move it quickly from one land mass to another. So again, as the overcrowding occurs, you see increase in death. For those of you who watch TV during COVID, what did they want? They wanted the old people to get inoculated first, to get vaccinated first, because we were the ones at the highest risk of mortality. And if you look at the mortality statistics from COVID since it began, you can see that a disproportionate are the old, the weak, and the young. Again, all symptomatic. Finally, there's behavioral changes that occur in populations. Increased territorialism. Hey, listen, all wars throughout the history of mankind have been fought for resources, but increased territorialism, I mean, isn't this what we're seeing in Ukraine? You see a decline in pregnancies. Well, I gave you a statistic before that we're seeing a decline in pregnancies globally. Now, some of that is social consciousness, but some of it may be related to the health of the members of the species. Violence increases. The graph on the right shows you mass shootings in the United States over the last couple of years. We've currently had 75 mass shootings in the United States this year, and we're only, 50 days into the year. So why are we having all these mass shootings all of a sudden? You may say, well, it has to do with society and gun control and all this. It also reflects that people can get information and people get irate quicker. It's very common, by the way, when temperatures rise for violence to pick up. So if you're into global warming, this may be another side effect of global warming. Another characteristic of crowded populations is cannibalism. I think we got this one covered, folks. I'm not terribly worried about this. We'll just let that one go. And then just weird behaviors in general. And I don't know about you, but if you watch the news, and of course the news specializes in sensationalism, there's a lot of very strange behaviors this year. And there happens to be a concentration of that in Washington, D.C. So what normally happens is that when a population gets overstressed, emigration starts. People try to move out of the densely areas, dense habitats, and move into less ones of a similar habitat. Now, just think about things like what's going on at the Mexican border. Think about the environmental refugees you're seeing from around, in the really hot regions of the world. You even hear now in the press regularly talking about environmental refugees. Environmental refugees are refugees who can't live in their home habitat because the environment is bad, because the temperatures are too hot. What are they doing? They're trying to move to safer spots that are more conducive to living and for their lifestyle. And you see this again, this is symptomatic of overcrowding. And I don't know, it may be the media, but it seems like every day we hear about a slug of refugees trying to get from one place to another. Again, possibly another sign of overcrowding. Here's some scary statistics for you. 36% of today's terrestrial mammals biomass are humans. Come on, folks, we're one of millions of species, yet we represent 36%. If you then take and add to that domestic livestock, 60% of today's mammal biomass is domestic livestock. That's principally beef and pigs. So together, 96% of the mammal biomass is human controlled or humans in themselves. We have 2.5 times more chicken biomass today than the biomass of all other wild birds on this planet. And there are studies that show that humans are currently consuming more than half of the Earth's green growth. I mean, these are stunning numbers when you think that we're just one species. Although when they said green growth, they didn't do a good job in defining it. And I don't think that includes algae, but it probably also doesn't include pine trees. So it's an impressive number. I talked about waste production. Methane emissions have risen 150% over the past 12,000 years, and nitrous oxide have gone up 63%. This slide is meant to impress upon you how controlling humans are on the planet, especially when it comes to biomass, which to many people equates with food. This is just one more graph of it, and it shows you that 100,000 years ago, there were a lot more wild land mammals than there are today, and that humans and their livestock are just overwhelming the system. It's estimated that more than 50% of Earth's usable land is now controlled by humans. This is usable land by human standards, not by animal standards. And one of the things that's happened, and I know you're all aware of this, but we've created these massive agricultural farms all over the world. And what they do is because they tend to be singular crops, they've created huge barriers for animals to cross over. And deforestation is another way that these barriers have been created. And then, of course, cities. So here's some interesting factoids about this. When you build one of these corridors that prevents animals from moving from one habitat to another, what scientists are finding is that the habitats that we're leaving them are too small for them to survive. And so it accelerates the extinction rate of these species. And part of the problem is we're just now getting a handle on how big these habitats actually have to be. Somebody'd say, oh, well, I've got a ranch with 5 acres of forest, that should be plenty for the birds. No, actually, the birds need, 25 acres or bigger. It also does another interesting thing. If you have a massive corridor with only one purpose, it's creating its own habitat and its own species. And I'll give you some really weird examples. The obvious one is New York City. New York City, what is the most common bird in New York City? It's the pigeon. Well, pigeons happen to like city structures, and so they do very, very well there. In the case of New York, the other big animal that's very residential is the Norwegian rat. I don't know if you've ever seen one, but these guys are big. I've seen them because I was raised in the East. They can be 6-7 pounds, and it's called rat, Norwegian rat. But they like city. They like all the garbage. They're very comfortable living underground. In London, believe it or not, they've identified a species of mosquito that is only found in the subways of London. So the corridors are doing two things. One is they're excluding wild animals from moving across, a barrier to crossing, as well as they're creating their own domain of species. And I won't get into details too much, but you even get into the type of bacteria that are in your gut. This is also having an impact because of how humans live our lifestyle. We live in extremely sanitary conditions, so certain bacteria don't do well, others do well. We're starting to get speciation of our gut bacteria because of how we live our lives. I'm bringing this up not to scare you, but to understand that there's a lot of people who don't think humans are having any impact on the planet. And I've just given you a handful of statistics to show you that it's overwhelmingly the other direction. Bottom line is we're over consuming. Now let's add another layer on that. Everybody in the world wants to have the American standard of living, which is considered by society's measures as a high standard of living. Yet the US represents only 4% of the global population, and we consume 17% of the global energy, at least as of 2016. It's probably higher now. So we represent a really small part of the population, but because our standard of living is so high, we disproportionately use up more energy than any other group. The World Watch Institute, which is an environmental think tank, calculated that the Earth has 1.9 hectares of land per person for growing food, textiles for clothing, supplying wood, and absorbing waste. The average American uses 5 times that much. So this suggests that if everybody wants to have the high American standard of living, that we can only support a population of 1.5 billion people. Now this is a brain teaser, because I don't want to live in poverty. I don't want to live in despair. I like having all the creature comforts I have, but there's a cost to that. And the cost is we're maxing out the resources on the planet. And now I want to show you an example of this for mining. The global population is currently 80 billion. We produce about 46 billion pounds of copper a year. This averages about just under 6 pounds per capita. The average American consumes 13 pounds, or almost 2.5 times more than the rest of the world. So if we're going to have a 10 billion number population by 2050, we have to increase the copper production by 25%. And if everybody in the world wants to live at US standards, we need to increase that production by almost 200%. Well, how the hell are you going to do that? Where are you going to get the metal from? So here's the implications to mining. First of all, as we reach carrying capacity, the competition for land is going to increase. And the question is, who gets the land? Is it given to businesses or is it given to civilians? And what I find terribly confusing is that the anti-mining, the number of people against mining way outnumber the number of people mining. But those same anti-mining forces are demanding electric vehicles and the electrification and no fossil fuels. They want it both ways. The activists are going to have more land set aside. And this year in the United States in particular, this was quite evident when Mr. Biden took the boundary waters away, and he literally took billions of tons of copper, nickel, platinum, palladium ore off the market. And then the EPA shutting down the Pebble Gold Project. That's 100 million ounces of gold and gazillion tons of copper. And then if you haven't followed it, there's this new thing called the Road to 30, where scientists, particularly people involved in environmental scientists, want to set aside 30% of the Earth's landmass and 30% of the world's oceans and make them non-accessible to humans so that wild populations can live in peace and without us. I mean, think about that. We're willing to only give nature 30%. We want the other 70 to do whatever we want. It's kind of a weird number, but you're going to see more land put aside. And part of it is because of this overcrowding. We're going to have to start triaging who gets to use which land. So one question, just philosophical question, I don't have an opinion on this, is should special interest groups be allowed to prevent the production of critical minerals demanded by the global community? And special interest groups here, you can define it any way you want, but I'll give you one example. If you take the indigenous population on the North Slope of Alaska, it's several thousand people, and yet they're able to prevent the rest of the world from having the oil that's there. How much longer is society going to tolerate that? And I'm not saying that they're not entitled to their land and their way of life and all that. I'm just saying that there is going to be a breaking point down the road where what's good for the masses is more important than the rights of the individual. That sounds very communistic, I know, but when commodities get squeezed so much, you're going to see a change in societal opinion. And I think this is going to be one of the issues that's going to come to bear. One of the things that's interesting, though, is that with global warming, we got a lot more new land exposed, new rocks exposed, and they tend to be up in the northern climates. So As the glaciers melt, we may find more mineral deposits because they're now exposed on the surface. There's no question we're going to have to search deeper. Where's the technology? I mean, 3D seismic has become very popular of late, but we need a lot more technology to go a lot deeper. And if that's your bag, if you like developing new technologies, there's all sorts of opportunity for you, because we're not going to be looking to explore spatially. We're going to be looking to explore vertically. You know, you often hear the argument, well, we need to recycle more metals. But if you've taken Introduction to Metallurgy, you know that when people make alloys, it's so they don't come apart. So the question is there a technology to create recyclable alloys? I'm not aware of one, but I'm not a metallurgist. And even if we could recycle everything, the current research shows that there wouldn't be as large enough inventory or reservoir of recyclable metals to material and make a difference in the world going forward. So the idea that scrap and recycling is the answer to not mining, it doesn't hold up mathematically. If we're in a higher price environment, I mean, reprocessing tailings and dumps could come into play. Somebody put out a stat recently, there's something like 240 billion tons of tailings around the world. There's a resource where your waste ore ratio is pretty damn low. They've already been crushed once, so your comminution cost is probably pretty low. So again, you know, metallurgists, we need you, we need you. So basically, if we have less land available for mining, we need to develop new technologies to better utilize that land. So I have spoken, if you heard me speak last year or any time in the last couple of years, the supply-demand relationship is totally out of balance. It was out of balance before the pandemic, and it's only gotten worse. The problem is that demand for commodities is elastic, but supply isn't. So what happens? Well, the human population continues to grow, as I showed you the graph before. So everybody's going to be willing to pay more to be the person who actually wins that commodity. And, you know, we're seeing right now, this year alone and last year, where car manufacturers are cutting deals directly with the miners, where traditionally they'd go through metal traders, but they're trying to cut their cost and they're trying to be first in line for that commodity. And so they're skipping over the traders now and trying to deal directly with the mining companies. Metal prices are going to go higher, so we can mine lower grades. And if you've taken any courses in geology, you know that if you lower the grade, the number of tons goes up, sometimes exponentially. High cost producers can then become economic. And many of the smallest mines in the world are very, very marginal, if not, you know, money losers. Higher metal prices could make these smaller mines viable. Good news about small mines, they tend to have a smaller footprint, so there shouldn't be as much environmental opposition. But then again, they also produce less metal. Resource nationalism. I was listening to a podcast this morning on resource nationalism. Resource nationalism is basically when countries say, these are our metals, you don't get them. It's projected that that's going to increase because as we get overpopulated, the countries are going to try to defend their resources. They're going to try to keep their resources for them and not share them with other nations. So what does this mean to the miner? Well, it means if you're highly trained, i.e. you go to, you know, the great mining schools like Arizona, Colorado School of Mines, you go to the great schools, you're going to be in high demand because these countries are going to be wanting to develop their own resources and they're going to be willing to pay top dollar to get the best people in, as opposed to the system now, which is more of an open market system where the countries are anybody can work in any country they want. I think this can be a very interesting twist when it occurs. Resource nationalism hit the oil industry 50 years ago. You know, the big oil companies in the Mideast, the American oil companies in the Mideast, most of them don't own any of the land. What they got is they have very lucrative management contracts that they receive from the governments, but the government actually owns the land and the resources in there. The mining industry is going to go that way. And when you're reading the press about some country changing its rules where like Mexico right now is thinking about starting its own national lithium company. This is what you're seeing. You're seeing this transition that the oil industry had 50 years ago. You're seeing us starting to go down there. But again, lucrative management contracts take highly trained people. Highly trained people mean people with advanced educations and superior work experience. And there's little question that in North America, that training is we're one of the best places. Australia is also good, and a few other countries. We're also going to see political nationalism grow. We saw this in the United States in the 2016 elections. We've seen this in France. We're seeing this a little bit in Germany. But as political nationalism grows and people don't want to share across borders as much, it's going to lead to more conflicts, more wars, and more invasions. That's just a natural thing. If you have more of something that I desperately need, I may cross your border to get some. It's very food supply and low, then they'll go across the border to get it, and then you have the fights. I don't know if any of you watched the monkeys having it out over who's going to own the fruit trees. Just sort of amp that up through evolution to make it humans, and you're right back to where we're headed. So what happens if we actually hit the carrying capacity? And remember, the carrying capacity is a concept. I've given it to you in a linear sense, but it's multidimensional, and there's a gazillion factors that can change that number. But in an ideal world, if you're at carrying capacity, it means your birth and death rates would balance out. Right now, the population's continuing to grow, so it means the birth rate is outweighing the death rate. So age demographics would level out. Well, this is kind of interesting if you think about it, because do young people and old people consume the same products the same way? Absolutely not. We have entirely different buying habits. I buy the expensive wines, you can't afford them. It's just a natural thing. And the young and also view the planet and society quite differently. I have two wonderful children in their 30s, and when I sit down and talk to them about how they look at the world, it's entirely different from how I do it. Neither one of us is right or wrong. It's just what our experience has led us. But as society balances out, the young should start taking up a much larger proportion as consumers. And what do they want to consume versus what we want to consume? How do the younger generation, your generation, look at society versus how my generation looks at society? They're quite different. And if you can take that the next step to what does that mean for metals, you're far more intelligent than I am. I think you also have to point out that technological innovation is always part of the solution, and it's also part of the challenge. I mean, if we figure out some new ways to get metals out of the ground without disturbing the ground and all this through technology, at least the metal part of the equation could serve a much larger population. Carrying capacity could go up. If we figure out better ways to get food, maybe grow food in hydroponics rather than in giant fields, we could support a lot more people. I mean, there's a whole lot of factors here. So I'm not trying to give you an end of the world scenario here. I'm just saying this is where we're going. And the change that we're going to see, we're already seeing it. It's quite dramatic, but that's your opportunity. Change is always opportunity. And what you need to do is think about how you're going to capitalize on it. Now, let's add on the impact of climate change. Every organism has a preferred temperature range that they like to live in. I'm a very obsessive fly fisherman, and I watch the river water temperatures very carefully. And last year, when the waters were getting up to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, Colorado and Montana actually shut rivers down because the fish were getting stressed out from the heat. Every animal has that. You have it too. I have a very dear friend of mine who's Greek origin, and he thinks it's nothing better than hot weather. I like Colorado weather where you get some good and some bad. The people, though, in some of these areas where the temperature has climbed so much are getting very uncomfortable, and they're trying to move out of that temperature regime. Also, as I mentioned before, rising temperature, they have plenty of studies to show that rising temperature increases violence. So what is our optimal temperature range? As the planet warms, what you're going to see is you're going to see flora and fauna move to preferred habitats. Again, with respect to fish, the Pacific herring, the waters off California are too warm for them. So they've moved north up into the Bay of Alaska. They've even seen triggerfish, which is a tropical fish up in the Bay of Alaska. Well, what are the consequences of that? Well, the California seals didn't migrate. So the number of pup seals that are starving to death has gone up orders of magnitude. And the mothers aren't breeding, as I said before in one of my slides, and they're not taking care of their kids because they're just trying to survive themselves. Trees that are normally at a certain temperature range, as it warms, they will move uphill. That will completely change the environment, but you can only go uphill for so far before you go extinct. So how is this moving of habitats going to impact threatened and endangered species? Well, there's plenty of papers out there talking about the extinction rate has gone up. I'm a little skeptical of those papers, by the way, because of how the data is collected. But there's no question that habitats are trying to move. And how can they move if we have these giant agricultural corridors they won't cross? How is this going to impact water usage, drought, and protected waters? And again, I'm not a screaming environmentalist saying the world is coming to an end, but if you're in the process of doing a feasibility study on your mine, particularly if it's a long life mine, 20, 50 years, these are all issues that you're going to face. But are you pre-engineering the solutions? Is anybody even thinking about solutions on what happens if you're in an area that has no endangered and threatened species and all of a sudden you're loaded with them because they've migrated into your area? These are issues that scientists today need to start thinking about, and we need to plan for how we're going to deal with the eventualities. Again, great opportunity if you're an environmental scientist and or if you're a hydrologist. These are big food for thought. But the one thing that is apparent is that as the planet continues to warm, it's going to reduce the amount of living space. And the argument, yeah, well, we'll just turn the air conditioning up higher. That won't work because you're getting your electricity from the lakes and the rivers that are going dry. So you may not have that electricity. Cost of electricity will go through the roof if they shut down the Colorado water system, because where are you going to get the electricity? Again, supply and demand. You need to think about this contextually, particularly if you plan to be around for the next 50 years. By the way, now we throw in my favorite subject, the internet. The free flow of information has made the world more interconnected. Information and ideas flow quicker, people's opinions form quicker, and what this does is it actually makes the world a lot smaller and a lot more reactionary. Local communities are now global communities. Large groups react to sensationalist media. We see more conspiracy theories now. And when I see these conspiracy theories, I don't think in the sense of, oh, that's a dumb conspiracy theory. I think about, why do we have so many all of a sudden? What's causing the increased amount of misinformation and conspiracies? And it has to do with the speed that internet information can be conveyed. We're now seeing that the court of public opinion overrules common sense. And there are so many areas of society right now where when I read these articles, I just scratch my head saying, are they serious? What happened to common sense? And the problem is it makes harder for facts to lead decisions. And we're seeing the world get a lot more emotional and react a lot more without facts. But our job as scientists is to live and make decisions by facts. And our real job is to make sure we get the facts right. So here's a couple of big questions for you to think about. If we're using up the biomass of the planet, it gets harder and harder to justify mining on food generating land. So how are we going to do that? It's going to contribute to the supply problem. But let me take it a different place. We have these giant open pits, particularly for porphyry copper deposits. What are we going to do with those pits when the mines are done? Did anybody ever take any time before they designed the mine to think about how they would use that site afterwards. I guess the walls are pretty steep. You could do some form of hydroponics in them. But who's thinking about this issue that mining disturbs land? It's a necessary evil of being a miner. I think open pits will eventually be phased out because society won't allow them. But what are we doing with the land after we're done mining? There's some really interesting case studies right now. There's one that came out last 2-3 weeks about how they're developing gravity battery technology by using old shafts. I'm sure you're all aware that there's now giant mushroom farms underground in old mines. People are trying to figure out ways to use these mines afterwards. How do we repurpose the mines? But more importantly, we need to figure out how to repurpose them before we build them. Not sort of an after, well, let's do this afterwards. There's great stories in South Africa where the coal mines, which are, they call them open cut. They're basically, they're not open pits really. They're just big cuts. They're now some of the best black fishing lakes in South Africa. Teck Corporation has a well-known trout pond up near their smelters that's got trophy trout in it. We need to incorporate this in our early thinking. So who's teaching courses in after mine is over uses? I think it'd be a fascinating subject. And I think there's an infinite number of things that we could do because we're clever. There's no question higher metal prices are going to help this whole problem. It allows us to lower the cutoff. But consumers always want to buy products at the lowest cost possible. So they have kind of a conflict of interest. They can't have low cost products and then drive metal prices up, which is exactly what they're doing. I mean, look at lithium prices. Everybody wants lithium batteries. Yeah, well, that's why lithium prices are what, 3 or 4x what they were 2 years ago. You don't get it both ways. And the question is, how is it going to be balanced out? And I'm not talking about the crazies versus the sensible. There will be mechanisms that will be imposed that will bring prices down and also, let them rise to some level. And it's going to be interesting whether that's done through government legislation or gone through supply and demand or whatever. Here's an idea that I came up with, which is very few mineral discoveries or any more are ever made on virgin ground. They're almost always made in existing mining districts. So why don't we take these large historic districts and define them, legislate them as mining reserves, and then have some sort of expedited rules so that you can mine there. Again, the environmentalists are always talking about, the three-legged frog lives there. Well, after you built a giant porphyry copper mine, probably not. But there's probably still ore left behind that could be mined down the road if metal prices get higher. Why not formally set these aside and make them mining reserves where you're always allowed to mine? Because you've already done the damage with the disturbance, rather than every time somebody wants to build a new mine, they've got to go through this incredibly long, painful, and unfair process of getting stuff permitted. These are the sort of issues that you need to think about because this is your future, not mine. So finally, what do you need to think about? You need to think about the planet in terms of it's reaching its carrying capacity. And what that means. Hopefully I've given you some indications, some insights. As I said at the beginning, it's a complicated problem. There is no solution, but there's wonderful ways that we can do better. How is it going to change the supply-demand picture when we're at the carrying capacity? We're no longer living in a world with exponential growth of human beings, a lot of young, very few old. It's going to change. What is that going to do to supply-demand picture? And what role can you play in forecasting it and hopefully making your millions doing so? How is the land going to be allocated between business and civilians? This, to me, is the biggest issue. And right now, the civilians, the special interest groups, the very small populations of people that are stopping global tier 1 size mining projects, they have the upper hand. But as metal prices go through the roof and you have to pay $500,000 for a Volkswagen Bug, society's moods will change about, who should get the metal and all of that. What breakthrough technologies are needed? Breakthrough technologies for every aspect of our business, including social education. including management, including governance. We need breakthrough ideas on how to do it better, how to do it different in this world that is going to physically change because of what we've done to the ecosystem. And then, the final one is, what interests you? What do you think is the most interesting part of this change? And how can you position yourself to benefit? Position yourself in terms of going into academic, government, starting a consulting company, working for a big mining company, getting sponsorship from investors who want to see us go from A to B, change this, that, or the other thing. The trick is for you to determine, identify that change, and then try to capitalize on it. And to me, I wish I was 40. I told you this last year, but what a great time to be in a world with so much change, because change equals opportunity. So with that, I'd be happy to field any questions you might have. You awake, Sarah?
Yep, just waiting to see if anybody chimes in.
Hey, Doug and Sarah, this is Jürgen Brun.
Hi.
We were listening. I was here with two colleagues from Germany, and they're actually working on post-mining research. Just want to point that out. But I have another thought for you, Doug. One is here, we're trying to get away from fossil fuels. We're patting ourselves on the back using renewable energies from solar and wind and all that. And you mentioned we need about, what, 2 times more copper? I would say I've heard figures of 4 times or 6 times more copper to satisfy the demand for renewable energies. That seem to be the fashion word now.
Yes.
So where does this copper going to come from? Are we going to mine that in Arizona? Or are we going to mine that and outsource this problem of ever bigger areas that are occupied by copper mines? Are we going to outsource that to Peru, to Chile, to Palabora in South Africa, to Australia? So that problem puzzles me.
Well, no, you're exactly right. And I mean, you can look around the world, and I can pick on the US because I'm an American citizen and we have a God-given right to pick on our government. But, the one hand, Mr. Biden is shutting down major areas for metal production. On the other hand, he's talking about how we need all these critical minerals and giving money to the lithium companies. And it's kind of like, how do you have it both ways? I think copper, to me, I don't believe copper is a critical mineral. Yes, it's a green mineral. It oxidizes green. We all know that. But the copper is probably one of the most important metals in the world of all metals, because it's used for, it's the best for electrification, runs circles around aluminum for conducting electricity, what have you. Yeah. I don't know how we're going to solve this problem. One way we're going to solve it is prices are going to go through the roof, and then people won't be able to afford the products that use that metal, and that will reduce the demand part, and then the prices can equilibrate a little more. But I don't have a solution for it, because the governments say one thing and then do the exact opposite. But when copper prices hit $6 or $10 a pound, I guarantee you there will be change, because society will demand change. And the question is, what could that change be? And that's an open question in my book. But thank you for your question. It's a good question.
Yep. Thanks, Doug.
Thanks for staying up late.
Yeah. No, actually, we're here in Golden, so.
Oh, okay.
We're on the same clock, so.
Okay.
Anyway, very good.
So Doug, let me ask you this. I'm Priscilla Nelson.
Hi, Priscilla.
Hi there. So the issue of going deeper for mining, and I agree with you that we won't be able to do open pit kind of operations in the future. It won't be allowed. So we have to go deeper, and we have to go hotter, and we have to go to high stress situations. So that leads us to this. One of the technological innovations that are needed are really related to automation and robotics. And that is not moving as fast as I would have thought it would. And it seems like maybe there needs to be more of a partnership between, for example, at Mines, the mechanical engineering department that has over 1,000 students in it, and the mining engineering department that has 40 students in it, and actually develop that sense of curiosity of how do you do this effectively, because we can't keep operating the way we are now.
Yeah. So you raised several questions there. Each one is worthy of its own conference. The first one is with respect to automation. Automation's been around a long time. I remember going to PDAC 15 years ago, where you could, on the stage there, you could run an automated vehicle underground in Sudbury, which was hundreds of miles away. Part of the problem with underground automation is it took them a long time to get the communication systems to work right. I'm sure you're aware of this. It seems like they've now fixed that. Automated equipment is all over the place. The other thing is, if you ever read Karl Popper, who wrote the book on the nature of discovery, a lot of times science needs to advance to a point where that technological discovery can be made. The best example is steam engines. Steam engines were discovered in invented in 3 different countries in the same year by 3 people who didn't know each other, because the technology had finally got to the point where that invention could be made. And I think what you're asking about is very germane to that. When you look at the amount of money that the big car companies are putting into autonomous vehicles, the technology is coming very rapidly. Hasn't gotten to a point yet where it's applicable to our world, probably a little bit, some, not entirely. The other thing that you brought up, which, and I don't want to criticize universities any more than I do every day. However, you got to get rid of these damn silos between colleges and departments. I was part of the Lowell Institute at the University of Arizona. We worked across campus. We had probably 10 different departments involved in various mining things we were looking at. The silo, the old-fashioned silo approach to universities is passé, and it's not working for exactly the reason you said. We need crossover of technologies. You have it there on campus. All you got to do is walk 100 yards. Why aren't you doing it? And it's because of the, the territoriality of departments and stuff. It needs to be broken down.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, anytime. Comprehensive talk, no questions.
On your chat, Bati has one for you. He hates the idea of a lot of people against mining and wants to know how they can be convinced that any supply chain starts mostly with mining.
That's a good question. And right now we have a real opportunity, because with lithium prices going through the roof and a few other commodities going through the roof, the average citizen is finally realizing that mining plays a role in their daily life. The traditional problem the industry had is that we create the products, which we then sell to either smelters or metal traders, who then sell it to the consumer. And so we've had this dislocation between us and the consumer. And when the consumer is directly impacted by your metal or any of your commodities, then all of a sudden they'll pay more attention. And what we need to do is to capitalize on that situation, which is, right now it's the best I've ever seen in the sense of consumers are concerned about metals. So we need to jump in and use it to change our message. The problem is you'll still see pieces on mining that'll be showing you mining practices from the 1800s, and they're basically selling it as today's practices. What we need to do is to put out shows or get on the news and show them how bloody high tech we are these days, how we use 3-dimensional modeling, how we do all this stuff to impress upon them we're not a bunch of old guys with mules and shovels. And I always get upset when I see that. I also get upset when I see mining companies do that. You're not helping yourself when you're pitching the good old days. You need to pitch the future, and the future, we're there. I mean, that's why all of you are in school. You're learning the best technologies. Are you talking to your friends about these technologies, or you don't talk about mining because you're embarrassed? You need to stand up and be heard. Any other chat questions?
Sorry, I have a question though. Please, some of your PhD candidate question. Guys, 1 second. So what do you think about, you mentioned this problem of conflict of interest between making money and keeping the planet safe, or at least sustainable mining. I think one of the major problems related to this is the amount of minerals, amount of resources that the manufacturing industry consumes. I may say 25 years ago, my father bought a kitchen and it's just working just fine. But nowadays, after 2 years of guarantee, the same kitchen is no longer working. So this omni-consumption behavior is pretty much consuming and asking the industry, the mining industry, to keep producing more and more. Do you think there is an actual, a realistic way to convince the most powerful industry or most powerful companies that are basically the head of the manufacturing area to go against this obsolescence schedule and instead try to optimize those or the use of those resources?
Yeah, I think you're bringing up a political argument, but I think it's a really sound one. And I don't know about the rest of you, but you know, the fact that I have to buy a new cell phone every other year for $1,000 as opposed to replacing the broken part myself. We see this with so many appliances where, you know, traditionally you could fix it yourself. And now they want you to buy a whole new whatever, which is wasting metal and forcing you to spend a lot more money than you should have to fix something. I think this is an issue that's going to have to be legislated. I don't see any other way around it. I mean, I had a car for 12 years and I cleverly blew the engine in 2019 in a snowstorm and had to buy a new car. And sometime during that 12 years, they had switched all cars to become computer driven. And all I keep thinking about is, you know, if my car ever broke down, there's no way in hell I could fix it. I'm not a computer PhD. The old days, you could, you know, replace the battery or fix a hose or, you know, get some duct tape to fix an electrical cord. But now it's all run with computers. So the cost anytime you need to fix your car means taking it into the dealer where they charge you an arm and a leg. I think the manufacturing industry needs to be held accountable and make things cheaper by you being able to fix them yourself. And in doing that, we would reduce our wasteful use of metals by orders of magnitude.
So somewhat related, Doug, I invite you in the last minute or so to reflect on artisanal miners.
Yeah.
There's hundreds of thousands of people involved in artisanal mining. And I mean, there's an urge to have them actually a viable way of life in artisanal mining, but there's also conflict. So what do you think is going to happen in the future to the artisanal miners?
First of all, I appreciate what the artisanal miners do. They do it to feed their families. I don't like how they do it because they couldn't give a damn about the environment because they're trying to feed their families. These are not wealthy people. These are extremely poor people. There has been countless efforts that I'm aware of over the last 15 years to organize them in cooperatives. It has not been successful. I think the worst thing about artisanal miners is that the large mining companies, big public, multi-tens of billion dollars of companies that are doing everything right are always associated with these people who couldn't care less about the environment. So what you need to do is you need to organize them, first of all, in a way where everybody feels they're being fairly treated. That's number one. And the question is, why hasn't somebody come up with a model? And I don't know what the answer is. The second is, if they're going to get government subsidies, it should be to replace the poisonous chemicals they're using and giving them equipment that gives them equivalent gold recovery or whatever their cobalt recovery without polluting the rivers. And I think if somebody had the capital to do that, you could transform them very quickly from being so destructive to the environment and giving us such a bad reputation to being a noble profession and one where they can feed their families and know they're getting a fair price.
Yeah, but it's going to continue right into this future of crisis. We're going to continue to have artisanal miners.
There will always be deforestation and artisanal mining and bad things on this planet because the poorest of the poor have to do what they can to feed their families. and that comes first, and their own survival comes first.
Yep.
And I don't think that we can bail everybody out financially or through support. It's like poverty. You know, you hear these billionaires all wanting to eradicate poverty. You can never eradicate poverty. There's always going to be somebody who's the poorest. And if you look at the poverty statistics, something like we've reduced poverty by whatever UN metric there is by 40% in the last 20, 30 years. We don't hear about that. All those poor people. There's always somebody at the bottom. There, you can't ever get rid of them. It's just a fact of math. Sorry, I don't mean to be rough on it, but these things don't make sense to me when you can never eradicate. I mean, even polio, they've eradicated kind of, still around, you know.
Yeah, so just as a follow-up, I'm wondering about, have you read Donut Economics?
Who's economics?
Donut.
No, I haven't.
Okay, I will send you a copy of Donut Economics. I invite you to read it, and then we can get together and discuss it. It's by
Great.
Kate Rayworth, and I think it's a vision that provides a framework for mining to think differently about itself. So
Well, good. That's what we need more of. And we need, you know, we have wonderful people in this business. I always get really disheartened when you see a reporter with a microphone making us all out sound like we're evil, bad doers when we're providing them with the metal for their microphones and the metal for their trucks. Drives me crazy, but these dislocations have been around forever and we can't seem to break them. I have no idea why they exist and why we can't break them, but it's just part of how society is. We support things we like and we don't support things we dislike. We don't often realize they're related. It's you ever had a 4-year-old, you'll learn that one. Other questions?
And Doug, Mary's got one for you in the chat. She asks, how significant a role will recycled metals play? And makes the comment, it could be significant for copper.
Recycling will always be, a very small part. The only exception to recycling is aluminum cans. Every aluminum can is recycled every 90 days, but it's the nature of the metal that allows that. But when you're doing nickel ferro alloys and molybdenum steel and stuff like that, the amount of energy to separate them is far greater than the value of what you'd get out of it. So I don't ever see alloys being a big deal. I'm not a scrap metal guy, so I don't know what the current volume is of copper scrap in the world. But the reason that most of the copper in the world is produced by mines and not by scrap is because it's more efficient. How's that for ducking an answer? Anybody else in the chat room?
Doug, this is Kadi Dagdalan. I wasn't going to say anything, but I'm going to make a comment. In 1974, in one of the humanities class that I took at Colorado School of Mines, we read a book by Jack Ellul. It was Technological Society, and how our current system creates needs that we have to satisfy. And he was questioning the fact that is the system that we have right now that need creating technological society is the sustainable model?
Yeah. The answer is absolutely, because creativity is the hallmark of human ingenuity. And if you don't want to have technological advances, then everybody has to not be creative and think out of the box and try new things. I mean, Kadre, when you and I were kids, did we have cell phones? Can we live without cell phones today? That's the beauty of technology. It's advancing society through more sophisticated applications. And that's the nature of the human brain. We're always thinking of a better or newer way. I don't agree with anybody's argument that technology is maxed out. I think we're just at that point of breakthrough. And as I was saying before about how science advances to the point where something can be discovered, it's not always linear. I mean, you can get to a point where 1 billion things can be discovered. And I think that's what we've seen with the whole surge in computers. And now we got AI. We're going to a whole new generation of technological breakthroughs because AI is finally gotten sophisticated enough to be useful. And it's just the nature of technology. So I don't know. I don't buy that argument at all.
Thank you.
Anytime, Kadri.
Enjoyed your presentation very much. Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
Does anyone else have any other questions for Doug? Well,
Good.
thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you so much, Doug, for presenting and giving us that different perspective and things to think about.
All right.
Thanks, Doug. Great talk as always.
Everybody take care. Be careful with that snow out there.
Yeah, take care, Doug.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Doug.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, Sarah.
Oh, of course. Thanks.
Hang on, Sarah. Let everybody get off. We'll talk.
Sounds good. Oh, I got it.